Hello and welcome to the Paranormalist Podcast. I'm your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist herself, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you this almost spring day?
I am absolutely fantastic. There's been sun for 2 straight days. I've been outside putzing around and had a wonderful weekend. So I'm in a great mood.
It's amazing that Mrs. Stu and I were out yesterday, which was the last day of February, in short sleeves. Now we weren't wearing shorts, although we probably could have, but yeah, it was a nice day, And today's a bit colder, but the warmer days are coming. I looked at the long range forecast and saw some sevens. I got excited.
Yes, indeed. Now there's a little bit of rain headed in our direction too, but it's going to be rain, not snow or ice. So
I've
yay.
I've never had to shovel rain, so I
Me
don't care.
either. Well, to be
So,
honest, I live in the woods, so I don't shovel anything. I just make a trail.
there you go. Well, if you are first joining us, we'd like to really thank you. It's people like you that keep this podcast going. If you could please click the like, click the subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Subscribed. My goodness, I can't talk today. Everything about the podcast you'll find in the description down below on whatever platform you're in. Usually I talk about it like we're doing YouTube most often, which is where we primarily publish, although I think most of our listeners are really on Spotify and the audio platforms. But regardless of how, you'll find in the description everything about the Paranormalist podcast. And with that, I'll ask, what's our topic for today?
Mirrors, but not like we've ever talked about before. So I've been doing deep dives and I have found some really amazing things.
So
And I
we're
want
not doing like psychomantiums or anything like that, right?
no, I mean we could touch on
Yeah.
psychomantiums, but we're not doing
Mhm.
that this week. But
Fair enough.
no, so I was like doing a little bit of research on something else and I stumbled across something and it said um during a revolution, one of the first things that happens after, whatever falls is that historically they would go out and the people who were the rioters, the people who were the revolutionaries, one of the things they would do, they would go into the castles or they would go into the rich people's homes and they would take the mirrors, those beautiful big ornate mirrors that they used to have in on the French homes and chateaus and the Russian castles and the all these beautiful buildings. And I thought, okay, that would be kind of, I could see with them stealing them because, they're beautiful and probably worth a lot of money. And then they said, but what they do is they smash them. And I was like, well, that's kind of sad. And then I started to, really like look at why would you smash all of the mirrors in a country, historically speaking. And I came up with a deep dive that brought us to this today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about it because we're not aware that mirrors had a totally different meaning before the modern times. So there is mirrors weren't looked at as just something to look into to brush your hair or check your clothing. They had other capacities. In the West, we know of a couple of them, but I'm going to tell you some other ones that are just insane. So, of course, the one that we probably are familiar with is people covering a mirror when somebody passes away. That was an old custom from Great Britain and Europe, and it traveled to the United States. And the reason was there were people who believed that the soul would be captured, the soul of a person who had just passed away might get captured in the glass. Now, this dates actually all the way back to the Romans. They believed that souls could get captured. And that's actually the reason why, there's that 7 years of bad luck if you break a mirror. It goes all the way back to the Romans, and they believed that if you broke a mirror, you would fracture the soul inside the mirror, and it would take 7 years for the soul to renew itself and repair itself. So for those of you who don't know this, and I don't know that the Romans knew this part, but every 7 years, all the cells in our body regenerate. And they believed the same about the soul, that every 7 years it would regenerate. So if you broke the mirror, you fractured the soul, and it would take 7 years for it to put itself together. Now, the Mesoamerican cultures, the Aztecs and Mayans, things like that, they had a completely different belief. They made mirrors that were of obsidian, and they believed that these mirrors were portals to a different realm, and that they could communicate with the gods and their ancestors through these mirrors. In China, mirrors were considered spiritual protection. They were engraved with protective symbols to ward off evil spirits, and they even could cause evil spirits to be terrified if they saw their own reflection. So you want to keep your mirror very shiny. Divination, which is looking into a mirror to um, look for the future, what you talk about. Well, I need to know about the future. Who will my husband be? That would be one that young girls would use to detect who thieves were, to communicate with the spirits of the dead, and in some instances, we're going to talk about angels. And then the next thing that fascinated me was this: mirrors today are manufactured en masse, correct?
Mhm.
You go to the Dollar Tree and someplace like that, and you can buy a mirror. But mirror making used to be a sacred act.
Well, yeah, it was
And
expensive too because they had wasn't it silver that was deposited on the back of the glass?
yeah, silver was
Mhm.
deposited on the back of the glass, and they would make there were incantations that would be said over them, certain herbs used in the making of them. Um, the symbols would be carved into them and covered over, but underneath the silver there would be these symbols, and these mirrors could be made for good or for ill. There were mathematical formulas that were used. There was one of the things that they did were, for some of the mirrors, were something called a crossroads burial. So since the beginning of time, crossroads have held some sort of satanic or magical place, and Albertus Magnus required that um, he would anoint a mirror with specific inscriptions and bury it at a crossroads at an uneven hour for 3 days. And then the mirror would be cured. That's what he called it, cured or anointed. And then the mirror would serve a purpose. And it wouldn't just be a looking glass, it would literally be, and we're going to talk about some of the things that these mirrors could do. And one of the other things that was very important is that there was an avoidance of the first gaze. So often the maker, um, they would often warn the maker should not be the first person to gaze into the mirror. Instead, they would have the mirror, turn it around, and allow a cat or a dog or something to look into the mirror first to avoid trapping the maker's soul. So even alive, this thing could suck in his soul, and it would be a portal, and it might trap it in there or travel him to somewhere else. They also believed that there was the ability to charge a mirror. So they would take the mirrors out at night, and it was a very common ritual in some cultures. And they would, if you were going to use a mirror for scrying, which is seeing the divination, using them for seeing the future, or any sort of secret knowledge, you would leave it under the light of a full moon and sprinkle it with an infusion of mugwort, which also was believed to increase its powers. So there were a lot of really interesting things. And again, it's just insane. So a couple others that I'd like to talk about is they would do magnetic consecration. So practitioners would make slow passes with their hands over the mirror to transfer their personal magnetism while reciting prayers to prevent evil entities from attaching to the surface of the mirror. The blackened surface for scrying mirrors was often intentionally darkened using something called Stockholm tar or black enamel paint to create a non-distracting surface that allows the mind to relax and see visions. There were specific symbols used in the Chinese mirrors, and the smoking mirrors of the Aztecs were made out of obsidian and used for specific purposes. And throughout this next 2 weeks, we're going to visit some of this stuff and talk about it. There were often four animals, or totem animals, if you will, that were used in certain cultures to create patterns and also bring specific powers to a mirror. So there would be the azure dragon in the east, the white tiger for the west, vermilion bird for the south, and the black tortoise for the north. These would guard the owner against evil from any direction. So they might be placed on the mirror, one at the top, bottom, and on both sides to protect the mirror from bad spirits. There were also people, though, that did reptilian eyes. These were Mesoamerican mirrors. These were some of the smoking mirrors, and they would feature a glyph shaped like a reptile's eye, symbolizing one of their deities. And the mirror's role was to literally be an eye into the spiritual world. Alchemic signs were carved into them. The planets were carved into them. These mirrors could be used for either protection or for curses. There were, the Chinese had mirrors that they created that were anti-barbarian curses that they would put on them, that if anybody who was a barbarian would come into their culture and attack them and they took a mirror, they would end up being cursed by it. There were back to the sender spells, often spoken charms that would ensure the mirror would reflect curses back to the caster, turning the mirror into a spiritual shield so it would hit the mirror and then bounce back. There were funerally protective blessings in Egypt and in Roman tombs. They were inscribed with prayers that would provide light in the darkness and ensure safe passage to the underworld. And there were mirrors that were treated and created for that purpose. And again, it is just a fascinating topic. And so there are grimoire mirrors, there are consecration of elements. There are just so many different things that these mirrors represented. And again, you were a craftsman and you held a special place, almost a religious place, if you were creating these mirrors, and you had magical knowledge that were endowed in you, and you kept that sacred knowledge and you passed it on to an apprentice at some point in your life so that they could carry on your work. And the reason that the mirrors were destroyed is because when I talked about the very beginning about reading about mirrors being destroyed during revolutions and what have you, is because they wanted to kill the old self, the history of the culture, and so they would smash the mirrors so that you could not see into the past and remember what was. Now think about that. In the French Revolution, that would have made a lot of sense when the last Tsar falls and the communists take over in Russia. They don't want you to remember what life was like before, because it was filled with light and color, and that's not what the communists were all about. So they destroyed all the fine mirrors, the ones that would have been hundreds of years old, that were, had magic in them, to destroy that. And it was a way of breaking the culture. There was just darkness at that point, and they had released all the spirits that were in the mirrors and removed the memory and the history. It's an interesting concept, isn't it?
Quite. Mhm.
I had never thought of mirrors in such a complicated way. So, and we're going to visit some of the different themes throughout this week and next. And I have 6 themes I wanted to talk about today. So the first is like the haunted mirror. That's probably the classic one we as in the West are familiar with. And there's a phenomenal story of Bela Lugosi. Now, Bela Lugosi lived in lots of different houses. For those who don't know, he was an actor in the 1920s and 30s, and he was most famous for playing Dracula's probably his most important role, the one that he was most remembered for. And he had a haunted life, if you will. And so he talks about, as he goes through life, he talks about when he was a Hungarian born actor. He had a thick accent, which is kind of where we get that business of good evening. That's he used it in
Oh, he Yeah, he didn't even understand English from what I gathered. He would just learn his lines phonetically.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he
Mhm.
would tell friends
Mhm.
that he was born actually he was born on October 20th of 1882, and he was born on the western border of Transylvania. So like there was a lot of quirky things. Isn't that interesting? The guy that plays Dracula for the movies actually was born in Transylvania. And
Typecasting.
yeah, I mean, he played Frankenstein, he played
Hmm.
the Wolf Man, but the one role that really defined him was the Dracula role, which he played both on stage and in the movies. And when he was 12, he left home because he always wanted to be an actor. Now, you need to know that in the early 1900s, actors weren't thought of as celebrities. At that time, you were kind of a loose moral person if you wanted to be an actor, particularly for the women. And he decided to, he wanted to be an actor. He wanted to get into a theater. So he um, started out to try to work his way into a theater. However, World War I happened. And he's a teenager and he volunteers. He ends up in the 43rd Division of the Hungarian Army Ski Patrol, and he ends up going, being in the war for quite a while. He gets wounded in Russia. He ends up going to Vienna and then Germany, and eventually he finds safe passage to the United States, where he becomes a citizen and finally makes it into the movies. He was known as the Monster Man because he played all these monster characters. I think in part, if I might, um, especially in the beginning, he played like the Wolfman and stuff like that because in Frankenstein, because they didn't have a lot of lines,
Hmm.
so he didn't have to learn a whole lot.
Hmm.
And those were his earlier movies. And I think that might have been one of the things, like he was able to pull off the makeup, and that was onerous at the very least. And, he could do the part, but he didn't have to learn a lot of lines. As he got older, he did have to learn lines for for Dracula. That has a lot of lines in it for him. So he ends up moving, or he gets married. Actually he gets married like 5 times. And obviously none of the marriages last. And he moves from home to home. There's lots of houses in Hollywood area that he lived in. But at the end of his life, toward the end of his life, he lived in an apartment in a um, large apartment building in Hollywood. And in the bedroom of the apartment was this absolutely massive mirror. And people talked about how he would go in and stand there in front of it and gaze and talk to something in it that they didn't see. And he always said the mirror was haunted. And he would explain to his wife that he was talking to a woman named Hetty. Now, Hetty is somebody he knows, and he's had um, a long life with her. So Hetty was first encountered by Bela Lugosi when he was in his late teens. He said he saw this woman with yellow eyes whom just before he moved to America, he would have been um, he was stricken, just starstruck with her, and he had never seen anything like her. And she introduced herself to him as Hetty, and was asked about her, and he would say, "I was only a youth then. It was 1914 when I met her, and I glanced into her eyes. It was as though I had received an electrical shock. It is utterly impossible to describe the fire, the ecstasy that shot through my veins. In an instant, we were in each other's arms, and the world was lost." He talked about how she was in multiple relationships with men before him, how she was often abused. He went on to say that they spent 3 weeks together that were romantic and passionate. And then one night he left the apartment they shared to run an errand. And when he returned, she was gone. She had left without a trace. And she had taken from him everything he owned. So apparently she was a thief. The only thing that was left behind was a note penned by Hetty. And it was on the table. He opened it up and it said, "We may never see each other again, but remember, you will always be mine." Now, Lugosi would search the town for weeks. He was in a terrible depression. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep. And then the Great War, World War I starts, and he serves his country. So he thought that he was never going to see her again. But at the end of his life, towards the end of his life, she started coming to the mirror. He had been, his fourth wife was actually probably the woman he loved the most, other than Hetty. And he said that, everything was going well. He and his fourth wife were doing amazing. Financially, he was doing well. He was getting lots of work as an actor. She was very supportive. They had a lot in common. And then one night, he was finishing up a play and he hurried to his dressing room and she just had left, just like Hetty had. And night after night, he said he looked for her and she was gone. And that's when Hetty comes back into his life. He begins to see her at a distance, smiling at him. And then when he moves into this apartment, she is in the mirror. Now, at this point in time, he's going towards the end of his life and he's addicted to morphine. So he's losing his ability to work. And he would literally stand for hours and hours in front of this mirror. He would end up passing away at the age of 73 in 1956. He was buried in one of the capes and laid in a coffin to look like Dracula with the makeup and all. And his wife immediately, whenever he died, she covered the mirror. She left the apartment. She would not stay in the apartment after that. She believed that Hetty had come out of the mirror and took him away. That is what she believed. So the mirror is still standing there. There's a guy that comes in and runs the apartment, and he ends up telling his friends that there's something wrong with this mirror. And much like Lugosi, he begins to talk to the mirror. And then he tells them, and at the time, he doesn't know anything about the yellow-eyed woman, because that was kind of a sort of a secret that, Bela Lugosi he talked to his wife about it. At the very end of his life, he gave one interview where he mentions it. And his wife is the one who talked of the story, his last wife. And it's an unsolved case to this day, but this gentleman who rents the house after Lugosi's death, their apartment, and he's fascinated with his mirror. He sees the yellow-eyed woman in it. And one night something happened. The police suspect it was a robbery, but he's killed in front of that mirror and lays there dead all night in front of that mirror. That mirror has a very bad reputation to this day. It has been removed out of the bedroom of that house. It's been sold a couple times. Everybody that ever buys it, they talk about seeing either Lugosi, the yellow-eyed woman, or the man who died at the foot of that mirror. So it has a huge history of hauntings. And honestly, nobody keeps the mirror for very long. If they do, they put it in storage. They don't use it in their home. It's literally 8 foot high and 4 feet wide, and it's huge and very ornate and very old. And there is definitely something that looks out of that mirror. People have talked about seeing shadows. They'll be standing there, catch a shadow of something moving toward them, and when they look at the mirror, they see it step away. It's a very disconcerting mirror, to say the least. Now, I had said something about the Aztec smoking mirrors. I want to go back and tell a story about one of those. And interestingly enough, it's a story from Europe in
I didn't think there were many Aztecs in Europe.
Well, that's the interesting part. So I'm going to start with explaining how an Aztec mirror ended up in Europe in 1520.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, and you're right. This Aztec mirror, made out of obsidian, that's a volcanic glass, was made in Mexico, most likely. And it was booty from a Spanish conquest brought back. And it made its way from Spain to Britain and into the hands of somebody who some people recognize to this day. His name was Dr. John Dees, Dee. Now, in science books and math books and things like that, they will credit him as being one of the visionaries of science and mathematical equations. What they don't want to tell you is that he was something else entirely. He was actually a occultist, and this is what his primary task was. He ended up becoming connected to the woman who would become Queen Elizabeth I. And he actually committed an act of what could have been treason in order to, when he first met her and talked to her. So he was arrested in May of 1555 and taken to one of to the Tower of London. And because he was suspected of violating the Treasons Act of 1534, which meant that you were not able to predict the death of a monarch, a consort, or any of the heirs. And he got into a lot of trouble. He was an Oxford-educated Catholic man of gentry, possibly risking death, predicting that Queen Mary I was pregnant. And then he was asked what would happen, and he would say that Mary would die of childbirth, and that Elizabeth, her sister, would become the heir and the queen. And that got him into a lot of trouble because he had been hired by Elizabeth to tell the future, and she let it be known that she had hired him to do this. And after he gets out of jail, he goes to Elizabeth and says, basically, I predicted you would be queen, and here you are, and I will be a guide for you and take you through the political woes, but I will also do political magic, which is not two words we often hear together these days. And her relationship with him would last literally for decades. And he would use this mirror for scrying sessions. So basically, you are looking into this mirror, this polished black glass, and looking to see what's going on. What you're asking a question, I need to know what's about to happen. And he'd stare at it for ages. And he had a assistant named Edward Kelly, who would be the scribe who would write everything down. But Kelly would also hear. So Dee would ask the questions, and Kelly would say, the being is stating this or that. And sometimes they would both hear it at the same time. And so I wanted to share a little bit about what kind of things he was able to tell people. So Queen Elizabeth I, he would give her a lot of information. He would end up telling her that she needed to focus on maintaining shipping and a military on the ocean. So she put a lot of energy. That's basically one of the reasons that England became the best, had the best military on land and on sea. He was an imperial advocate. Beyond that, he talked about maritime expansion, British empires, navigating, and he was pressing that there was another world out there across the ocean, and we need to go and find it. Now, We're talking the 1500s. They didn't know what was out there. A lot of people still believed that there was, um, you know, monsters, and you fell off the other end of the earth when you got to the end of that. He predicted the coronation date for Elizabeth. He told her that she would be come the queen on January the 5th of 1559, saying that there was a celestial alignment on this day that would ensure a long and prosperous reign. She literally refused to take the throne until that date because he told her it would make her be able to live and be the queen for many, many years. He told her that the Spanish Armada in 1558 was going to attack and that she needed to have her fleet in specific places. And he said he saw it in the mirror. And they did exactly what he said, and it worked perfectly. Some of the other things, he told her that we needed to change the calendar. So there was something called, there was a different calendar that was in play up until 1583 when Dee told Elizabeth that there was a solar year drift and the spirits weren't happy. So we went to the Gregorian calendar because of that, which we use to this day, by the way. Scientific advisors argued about this. Some agreed, some didn't. And eventually, he convinced the Pope to sit on his side with him. He even ran a spy ring, a royal spy ring, utilizing information he got from that mirror. And his influence was so large that Elizabeth would refer to him as my philosopher, my sorcerer, and my guide. Think about that. He literally he actually, all his notes are in books and they were called the angel books. He said that angels came to him in the mirror and told him what to do. Now, the Aztecs said that they saw spirit beings and gods in the mirror, and that these beings gave them knowledge, sacred knowledge. His perspective would have called them angels, theirs called them gods. But they both said they saw the same things in these mirrors. By the way, that mirror still exists. It's in the British Museum in London, and you can actually take a look at it. It's not huge. It's from the photographs, judging from the stuff around it, it looks to be, I don't know, about a foot wide the most. But it's a fascinating story, and you can see how his influence even reaches out to us today. So that was a really interesting, usage of that mirror, and he swore by that mirror and protected it with his life until the day he died. And then his assistant had the mirror, and then it passed down through the generations in the Dee family. He returned to the Dee family, and it passed down there. So the next one is Marie Laveau and the voodoo mirror. Now, for those who, I'm sure most of you have heard the stories of Marie Laveau. She was a quadroon, which is part white and part other nationalities. And she was a voodoo queen in New Orleans in the late 1800s. And her mother and her daughter would also be voodoo queens. Now, she was a fascinating figure because she was political, she was spiritual. She convinced the rich businessmen, the wives of these businessmen, all of these people, that she had powers to help them fall in love, to, keep people from dying, to kill adversaries. And I had heard a lot of stories of her, but I had not known that one of the primary things that she utilized was a mirror. She stated that she had a mirror that was fixed with a spirit. So in her culture, a spirit would have been a loa, which could be any kind of demonic entity or soul. And she would hold the mirror and talk to it, and the spirit would come up in the mirror and she would see it, and it would answer her questions. And there are stories that the police would eventually begin to utilize Marie Laveau and the voodoo mirror because they couldn't solve certain cases, and the mirror would tell them who the crime was committed by. There are some really fascinating stories. So um, she was born in 1801. She, like I said, she was a free woman of color. She managed to navigate the political structure. Everybody thought she was gorgeous. Everybody thought she was amazing. She was classy. She had managed to marry upward, if you will. And she had her own home. She was introduced to both African and indigenous magic. She also was a Catholic. She had a lot of Catholic traditions that she used, and you'll find that voodoo is a merging of the Catholicism and African magic together, and then add into that the Native American magic that she also absorbed. And then she rises in the 1830s to the point of being the Louisiana voodoo queen. Now, people, like I said, they would look for herbal remedies, they would look for blessings, protections, love. Maybe a woman who was not able to have a baby would go to her and see if she could give her a fertility drug. There were legal issues, but I wanted to, she would tell people that she would spiritually intercede for them with the saints and the spirits. She had respect like you can't even imagine in today's culture. But as I said, police officers would discreetly visit her. She identified thieves and murderers, and they would use the information that was so accurate that this spirit, this Loa in her mirror, would tell them not just who did it, but how it was done, where the person was at, why it was done. So she could provide a lot of detailed information, and then the police officers would go and they would follow up on these clues, and eventually they would get these people and arrest them. Her spirit, her power wasn't just spiritual though. It was also social. It was political. She was a devoted Catholic and a voodoo priestess all at the same time. Everybody was either in awe of her or they were terrified of her. There was when she passed away at 79, she was buried at the St. Louis Cathedral in the St. Louis Cemetery #1. And her daughter, Marie Laveau II, would take over. And among the things that she took of her mother's was the mirror. And she continued to be able to utilize that mirror. And it is said that the police continued to work with her because her mother gave her the secret and convinced the Loa that her daughter was worthy as well. Now, people still leave gifts to this day at the cemetery where Marie Laveau is buried, and they say that she gives you blessings if you do that. So they'll leave gifts of a candle or flowers or even coins. And in order to get a gift from her, which might be better health or things like that. So this is a piece of folklore that's still being participated with today. And I thought that was a really interesting. I'd always known who Marie Laveau was, but the fact that she used this mirror and solved murders with it, I thought was interesting.
Yeah, you've touched on her before, but also didn't mention the mirror before either.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, if I touch on a story again, it's usually because
Mhm.
something new came up. And in this instance, I had no clue until I started really seeking out mirror stories. And then all of a sudden this popped up and I'm like, why did they not mention that in any of the other things I've ever read? But apparently it was well known. So our next story takes place in the 1600s in Russia in the North Woods. There were this was at the time of the Tsardoms, and it had not yet become a huge empire as it would be. There was a small monastery, Orthodox Christian monastery, at the edge of the wilderness near a little village, and it was basically. I like the way that they put it in the article that I read about it. It said it was a place of silence and frost where the monks copied manuscripts by tallow light and prayed through the long Arctic nights. It doesn't sound like a lot of fun,
Hmm.
does it? I know
Yeah,
you don't like
you
winter,
lost me at Arctic. Yeah, that's
I'm sure.
yeah.
So one winter's night, there was a stranger who arrived at the monastery gates. His boots were worn, and he carried no pack, no nothing. He asked for no blessing from the priest. He just went in. He gave his name is Gavrila, and he asked for shelter. The monks granted him that because they were the only place that he could stay, and it was bitter, bitter cold. And what they did not know was that he had been a thief and had been highwayman, basically, preying on merchants who were traveling. He had robbed a caravan only days earlier and had escaped from the Tsar's patrols. He had not escaped his own fears, however. So rumors spread through the region and talked about demons that followed unrepentant sinners. And he had heard these stories through um, the years. Well, they give him a cell in a monastery. A room is called a cell, just so people know what I'm talking about. It was a guest cell. And so basically, it had a little bed, maybe a tiny little nightstand, and a tallow, candle. I'm sure it was bitterly cold in there. And he was given a cot and then a couple woolen blankets. And there was a polished bronze mirror that hung on the wall. Now, mirrors were rare in monasteries, but this guest room had one.
Mhm.
It was a very tiny little mirror. And so he went into the room and settled in for the night. He was a little bit afraid of the mirror because it was a Russian belief that spirits could show the real person or their hidden nature reflected in a mirror. And as he walked in and sat down, he glanced into the mirror and he saw a figure crouching behind him. It was gaunt, and it was an ash gray demon with long, narrow face. Its fingers were sunk into something red and beating, and he realized it was a heart. And in an instant, he recognized that it was his heart. And the demon lifted its head and looked at him through the glass. And it stepped out of the glass in front of him. This demon, as it would have been in Orthodox folklore, didn't roar or scream. He whispered. You see, the devil doesn't need a big voice. It's the tiny whispers that lead us to downfall. And he whispered to him, I know who you are. I know what you've done. I know what's in your heart. The candle flame flared up, and there was no wind to stir it. The man sat there quiet, and he watched the mirror as the demon showed him all of his acts, not just the acts of theft, but all the small defiances as a child that led him to the road that he was currently on. He showed the merchants he robbed, the widow's goat he had stolen in a year of famine, the lies he had told the priest that night, the caravan guard that he had struck down in the snow and killed to escape, each sin spoken with precision, as though the demon were literally reading from a ledger, perhaps akin to the book of life in heaven. At that moment, Gavrila fell to his knees. Demons cannot invent sins, they can only show you what already exists in your heart. And so he knew the creature was not lying. He remembered most of those acts. And when the whispering stopped, the demon placed the still beating heart back into the man's chest, stepped into the mirror, and vanished. And the candle went out. At dawn, the monks found Gavrila sitting up on the floor, pale as frost, his eyes fixed on the mirror, but not daring to look into it, rather to just keep vigil, as though to protect himself from the demon stepping out again. He asked to see the abbot and confessed everything he had ever done, every single sin that the demon had whispered in the darkness. He begged to remain in the monastery, to be penitent. The abbot, following the ancient rule that no sinner is beyond repentance, accepted him, and Gavrila took the name of Brother Gerasim, after a saint known for taming lions, perhaps hoping to hold his own inner beast inside. And from that day forward, he never spoke again, taking a voluntary vow of silence. He never looked into a mirror, nor into still water, or even into polished metal. He lived in a wood cutting yard, performing the hardest labor without any complaints. He attended every single church service, prostrating himself more than any of the other monks. And the brothers whispered that he had seen a demon and had been judged more harshly than any earthly court could have judged him. And when Brother Gerasim died, the monks found him in his cell, a single object wrapped in linen, that bronze mirror from the guest room. He had carried it all of these years, though he had never once uncovered it. Some said it was a reminder of the night he saw his soul. Others say he feared that the demon would return if others could look into it. They buried the mirror with him, face down, according to the culture, so that the spirits could not rise. And the story has been passed down by word of mouth and written, and the thief who saw his own judgment in the monastery mirror, and whose silence became his repentance, has touched many others. And I think that's probably my favorite story from this particular episode, although there's a couple more really cool stories. So we'll go with our last story. And I want to say that this story is, I think everybody will like it as well. It's a beautiful story, to be honest. So this is on a highway out in Arizona in the middle of the night. And you have to have, lived in a cave to not know that the Arizona desert is long and flat, and you can see for forever. And this is a woman who in the 1970s, she would tell this story about something that happened to her. She was traveling alone on the road, and would glance up from time to time in the middle of the night, and glance up to see if anything was coming. You could see something far off if it was. And she was all alone. And then she glanced up, and she saw a man sitting in the back seat, dressed completely in white. He was still and he was silent. He didn't make a sound. She would turn her head to look backward. There was nobody in the seat. But when her eyes caught the mirror, he was there. He didn't smile. He didn't do anything. He just stared straight ahead. He just continued to sit there, and as she tried to figure this out, he just continued to watch her. And suddenly, the man in white leaned forward in the mirror. She could see him moving forward, and she felt no touch. She felt no movement, no jerking of the wheel, except that the wheel itself seemed to turn to the left, and just in time to avoid a sudden break in the pavement ahead that would have caused a horrible car accident. The road had collapsed, forming a deep cavity, and the car would have gone straight in. Her heart pounding, she grabbed the wheel with her both hands, and she wrestled it and pulled the car to a stop. And she looked up into the mirror, and the man was gone. And she turned and she looked. The man was gone. She would later tell the story to a police officer, and then she would share it in a newspaper article years later. I thought it was an interesting story. And I think here is where we will leave it for this night, because the stories are going to get a little darker next week. We'll leave it with a pleasant note. So for all of you who have listened to us tonight, be careful what you see in the mirror. You might want to put a cloth over it. And next week, I'll tell you a story about a mirror, or a series of mirrors, and the strangest murder or murderers that you've ever heard of. So for tonight, I'll say good night. Bye-bye.